Welcome to Love and Speak the Truth, a podcast with Sister B and friends. It might get messy, sacred to secular. Don't judge. All voices will be heard here. So listen up. We're going to explore the human experience through the lens of wisdom sharing and faith, with a worldview that might shock you, move you, even downright inspire you. Today, I am coming to you with a treat and a jumble of meaningful movements as we listen to United Nations NGO representative Janet Palafox. Janet comes to us from New York, where she works with other religious at the United Nations doing advocacy and education. Janet hails from Australia and has been in ministry at the UN since before the pandemic. In this episode, you will hear the challenges Janet faces in creating spaces for education, empowerment, and information sharing. We will get into the challenges of discerning how to educate for critical thinking and how they affect our policies and decision making. We go global, even as the cultural climate steers national. Listen and bloom. So, Janet Palafox, IBVM, it's so good to have you on the show. You're there in New York City, and it'll be so great to have a conversation with you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Brenda. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm doing very well. It's exciting to have conversations here just to help people to get a little bit of a glimpse of what we do as sisters, as companions, as people who we think could add some substance to the conversation that we have out there in the world. So I'm just so glad you're here. And let's just begin with a little bit about yourself, where you are, what you're doing, how you feel about what you're doing, and we'll get into the conversation around your work at the UN and so on. Okay, so tell us.
So, hi everybody, and thanks again, Brenda, for inviting me. So, I'm currently the representative, the NGO representative at the UN for the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary (IBVM) and the Congregation of Jesus, the CJs. So my work here is advocacy. So I'm not working in the UN, I'm working with the UN. So that's a big difference when I explain to people the work that I do here. It's really advocating about the issues, the social justice issues that the people that we with whom we work and live with are experiencing in various countries. And that's just not in the global south, but also in the global north, as we know. Um, Social justice issues doesn't only happen in particular countries. Unfortunately, it's happening everywhere. So that's the work that I do. I bring the voices of the people. um, I speak on their behalf if they cannot come here. But the most important thing is they are heard. So our preference, of course, is that the people are able to speak for themselves. So that's how we do our work here. I'm not the first one. There's been other representatives here because we've been here since 2004. We actually celebrated 20 years last year.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
yeah, so that's the work that I do, and the work that I do really is in collaboration with a whole lot of people, both here at the UN and also in the countries where we live and work.
Mm. You've been at the UN for what, about 3 years, 2 years, or 3 years?
I have been working since 2020, but because of COVID, I only came to the US in 2022. So
Oh,
yes, about 3, 4 years.
yeah. You were in Australia?
Yes, yes. I was working in Australia at the height of COVID because the UN actually closed. You weren't allowed to go in, but the work continued.
Mhm.
So we were meeting online.
One of the interesting things that, of course, I've had a couple other people on, Heidi Seneca. I've had Cecilia O'Dwyer, and they all sort of tie in the UN work and responsibilities that they were involved in there. But the focus that the Sustainable Development Goals have been kind of throughout our conversations. And I'm interested in the one about poverty. And I'm sure you can't pull them apart and make them separate. But the thing that struck me that I found interesting was when you sent me the book, the 272, that book written by this Rachel Swarms,
Mhm.
and she gets into this historical expose, if you call it that, on families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. Now, we're not going to get delve deeply into the book, but in your little card to me, you wrote, "Poverty is not an accident. It's a
Mhm.
decision made by nations and those who are in power."
Mhm.
Now, I would like for you to share a little bit about your perspective on that. Maybe you want to talk about the book yourself, but poverty is not an accident. And I know this is a part of the goals set by the UN to look at that and to figure out how countries, nations, governments, organizations can help to combat this issue. But talk a little bit about what compelled you to focus on, one, this book, and two, name that particular issue.
Yes, actually, that quote came from Nelson Mandela. So he was the one who said that particular quote. It's actually quite an interesting story. I was thinking about this, how I got involved in this particular thinking was actually by accident. It's just my mistake, actually, in understanding the English language. I was here in 2019 to intern with Cecilia Dwyer, who was the previous UN rep that I replaced. And there was one invitation that talked about reparation. It was organized by, I think it was African countries. At that time in Australia, we were looking at the issue of repatriation. And so when I saw this, I thought I was attending an event
Mm.
related to repatriation, which is, of course, the returning of refugees to their country of origin. And that
Mhm.
was an issue going around in Australia at that time. But when I got to this event and they started talking about the issue, I'm like, hang on, I think I got this wrong. But I was very interested to hear what they were talking about. And they were talking about the fact that if you look at the history of the world, what we call as the global south, where there is poverty, real poverty, and they're struggling to get ahead. So in previous times, they were called the developing countries or the underdeveloped countries. But if you look at the history of those countries, they're predominantly countries who have been colonized. And in the situation of Africa, in most of those countries, they were the countries that for whom they not only colonized, but they were enslaved. And so they were talking about the fact that now these countries, which is what we call the global north, the developed countries, the history is that they developed using the resources of these countries. And so if you look at the history of the world, of the economic history, and if you look at the systems that are current, it's a system that still favors the previous colonizers. So a case in point is we know a lot about Haiti. We hear a lot about Haiti.
Yes.
Haiti was one of the countries, the first country who actually liberated themselves from
Hmm.
their French colonizers.
Hmm.
And in the history of war and peace, we know that usually the victors are the ones that reap the benefits of the other country who they beat. But in the case of Haiti, they had to pay France because suddenly France didn't have this. They were considered chattels, so they had to pay France. And they only been able to repay France in the 80s, but this affected their situation tremendously.
Mhm.
And if you look at all the other countries, this is what you can see. So I'm like thinking to myself, well, they have a point. So I got interested in the financial part of the system, the financial system. So the sustainable development needs financing to
Mhm.
happen. So I got involved in how can we make this happen? And how is it that every single time these countries who are struggling, they borrow money from IMF or World Bank, and yet they seem to really struggle to get ahead. And for a long, long time, Brenda, I come from the Philippines. And so for a long time, we were made to believe that this is because corruption happens in these countries. That's why the country never make it ahead and all these things. There's a truth in that. But we know corruption happens everywhere, even in the global north.
Everywhere.
And so when I was listening to this group of people speaking, I'm thinking, that's right. I never thought about that historical financial history of the world. I never thought about that this group of people who have colonized are still the ones in charge of this financial system. So that was 2019. They spoke about reparations. So basically, they're saying their ask was that, look, you're saying to us that you're giving us aids, lending us money, but in fact, you need to pay us back. You need to pay us back for what you took from us, the gold, all the mine, all the minerals that you took from us, the people that you took from us, to make your country better, to make your world more developed. And so this was the whole story about this understanding that, well, it's time for payback rather than giving us aid, as you say. In fact, that's not aid. You owe it to us. And so that's the whole theory. And now there's this big push for these reparations, but also there's a big push for a more balanced financing
Mhm.
so that people, countries don't have to cover the interest of their debt instead of paying for the education system in their countries, for the health in their own countries,
Mhm.
um, and so that they can then get ahead.
Right.
So that's how I got interested in it. And of course, historically, I also come from my background is ancestors is from Spain. So Philippines has also been colonized. So I got interested in that. And then, of course, when I came here to the US, there's a museum here called the Tenement Museum. So the museum basically is they bought this old tenement and they recreated each room to be of the migrants who first came to the US in this maybe late 1700s, early 1800s. So it starts from the first group, which was the Germans, and then during the pogrom, Eastern Europeans, and then, of course, the Irish. And recently, they started talking about the situation of the African Americans because, of course, as you know, in New York, um, they were here quite early because the Dutch brought them. And so I got interested with the history as well. I'm a history buff. So I
Mhm.
got interested in that. And that's how I got to read about this book. And the other book that I read was called The Moon and Mars.
Mhm.
And it's a fiction, but based on I love fiction that's based on a historical era, and it's a fiction of a young teenager whose mother is Irish and whose father is African American, which apparently before the Civil War it happened quite a lot
Come.
because, as you know, the African Americans and the Irish were both marginalized in those times. So yeah,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
that's how I got very interested in the history.
Mhm. You know, what's interesting now is that sometimes history plays itself again and we don't realize what is happening because I feel our education system, our cultural identity in this country does not allow us to really focus on where we've been. So it's difficult to know where we're going. And there's a place where in that quote that I mentioned at the beginning, you said is accredited to Nelson Mandela. I see that happening over and over and over in our society. And we have an organization, we have a department in our world community, such as the UN, that is set up to help us look at the reality of these situations that's been going on since the beginning of time. All of us now mixed up in this particular country, we're all immigrants. We're all descendants of oppressed people, in particular from the African American community or the Black community. We are no longer African American, we're American.
Mm, mm.
Most of the people who immigrated and have been in this country for centuries were no longer a part of that country and now an American. Everyone that dwells here can see themselves as some other part of some other cultural background as well as American. The true Americans, the true native people, are the native indigenous people. The UN, in particular, set up by governments, represented by governments and nations, to combat the very things that we perpetuate. We perpetuate war and violence, we perpetuate poverty, a lack of education, and all those things. How do you see religious women at the UN facing these realities and making an impact on dealing with them? Or are they so overwhelming that it's kind of a vicious circle?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question you ask of me, because I have been thinking about this for a while now. Because, as you know, most of us religious, not just the women religious, but also the male religious, um, are quite well known for education, for providing education. How could we have offered education to all the people, particularly the leaders, because most of us have educated leaders, really, and yet the system hasn't changed in a lot of ways. And I think what we really need to look at now is how we are educating our students, especially now with all this misinformation and disinformation that's happening online, where most young people from like the millennials and the ones that are after them grew up on social media and all that. We need to be able to educate our students so that they can critically analyze all this information that's coming up then 24/7, to be able to understand which is truth, which is fiction, which is made, because the misinformation and disinformation is actually very strategic in the way they make it, because it's not 100% false, but it's often half truth. So our role, I think, is to start really educating ourselves to how to critically analyze this information, that we ourselves don't just share information that we get from our Facebook, from our Instagram accounts, and just forward it without thinking and without double checking if it's true.
Mhm.
AI is doing a lot of things. We see that here. We see a lot of this misinformation and disinformation happening that are created 1,000 times. And so you're bombarded by all this news, all this information, and our role is to be able to educate ourselves on how we can find out which is truth, which is disinformation, which is misinformation. I need to double check that before I share it with my network. And then we also need that to educate our students that way.
But when you talk about teaching critical thinking, knowing the right questions to ask, going to the right sources to get answers to those questions, what are some of the markers for getting those sources right? Not sort of just going on what is out there. I think there's a way where we've been duped into thinking that Mr. Google has all the right information. Some people even think that if they can find the answers online, that they know a lot. I'm not sure that our education system helps us to teach critical thinking, and so it's often a mystery as to where to get information that is accurate.
And you're writing that, Brenda. That is the challenge that we have now, because often you go online, you check it, and sometimes you think, oh yes, this is a website that's really, I can
Reputable.
trust this website. And yet sometimes those websites are fake.
Mhm.
But also not to just read through this one, but to, like you said, to delve deeper. Okay, someone, let's use an example that's just quite recent, in the sense of people saying the COVID vaccine has this implant that if they inject you with this, you will be monitored from everywhere. We can use our own brains as well. So, but you need to double check, where did this come from? Because I looked at that because I was interested, because some of my friends were saying, oh, but it's this and that, and Bill Gates bought this. And so you read through that and you see that, okay, yes, Bill Gates have bought some stocks a long, long time ago from this vaccine place. But the jump from that to having an implant is so ridiculous. But you also find out exactly, so where is this coming from? How did they come to that to that conclusion? But just to go back one, two, or three of the sources of
Mhm.
this information, we also need to trust ourselves. There is something not quite right with their the logic of this.
Mhm.
Because the other thing too, of course, Brenda, is that the AI, the algorithms make it so that if I click on one thing, it will continue to give me the same information of
Mhm.
that stream.
Mhm.
So they always say that even if you don't agree with the other group, you need to also start reading through that, so that your algorithm isn't just giving you one line of thought. Of course, for example, I follow the social justice side of things, and I don't just want to read that angle, because there is also a truth in what's happening on the other side. But I think the deliberate misinformation and disinformation uses a lot of emotions in the way they write the news, or the bit about what fact they're talking about. It uses a lot of emotion. And if you look deeper into the premises that they use, you'll find out that it's just not logical. It's really very, very hard, as you say. But for me, I always think, well, hang on, what is the reason for this person writing this? And
Mhm.
what has this person written before?
Mhm.
Have they been found out to be false before? What
Mhm.
is the purpose of this article? What is my previous knowledge of this situation that has happened before?
Mhm. So tell me some, Janet. How did a Filipino Australian IBVM, what was the path to that reality? Coming to the UN is probably where we are now.
I was born in Australia. As I said, Spanish background, Spanish Filipino background. My sister moved to Australia, and then we followed her. And actually, it was in Australia that I met the IBVMs. I was working then in the bank, and this is where the financial interest comes from. And I met the sisters. If I think about it, I met Mary Ward first.
Mm.
Because when I was thinking about, oh, well, maybe God is calling me to this thing, I wasn't sure. To be quite honest, I just wanted to have somebody say to me, no, this is not where you're being called. I really just wanted to check it out. And so I then decided, okay, let me read about. I knew that I had a bit of an inkling towards Ignatian spirituality or Franciscan. So there were the two things. And then I thought, okay, let me read about what are the groups here in Australia, who are their founders, and all of that. And so I read a lot about the founders. And it was quite interesting that, I never heard of Mary Ward. But when I read her story, I was really taken by it. The fact that she was so true to herself, despite all the things that happened in her life. And yet she was very forgiving. It's not something that I have. I can get very angry with people. And so I thought, well, that is something that I aspire to be, somebody who can be true to themselves and yet be forgiving of the people who hurt them. And so I thought, let me learn a bit more about this woman. And that's when I called the sisters, and all through this time I was always asking to be not asking, I was always waiting to be sent home and to be told this isn't what your calling is.
Mm.
But I'm still here, so there you go. My interest has always been social justice. Even in the Philippines, I was born and studied and all of that, and in university during the Marcos era. And so I was actually in universities during the revolution, the people power.
And then somehow after your training and all your ministry, you ended up at the UN.
The interest for advocacy, I've always believed really that we need to change the system. That was really critical for me. I remember after the revolution, so after Marcos was removed from power, I was always saying, no, we need to continue this. We need to continue educating people about this is not just about one leader you get rid of. It's about the system really that needs to change. And so for me, that was, I suppose, the attraction of where I was offered if I would like to work here, advocating at the UN. I thought, well, let's see, maybe this is something that we could work with and try to make a difference in the system globally. It's a struggle, I can tell you. It's very hard work. But I'm working with a lot of young people, and I'm seeing a lot of young people having this real thinking about the way the system works and trying to make a difference to change the system, even though for some of the young people, this system actually favors them. They're quite willing to change it because even though it probably favors them in the long run, it's not good for all of us. We
Mhm.
only have one earth, they say. And
That's
so
right.
they realize that. And I think that is what gives me hope,
Mhm.
the young people. So I hope that we can continue working with them, walking with them in this journey, because I think we owe it to them, is my thinking.
How does a Mary Ward woman change the system, this massive system that creates an environment where the powerful get more powerful and the rich nations get more rich and leave the very, very poor behind? How does a Mary Ward woman make a significant difference there?
Well, that's another difficult one to answer. I suppose the one thing I can do is pray, obviously. This is where, Mary Ward always says that, we can do our part, but we also know that we're not alone on this one. One of the saying that she has that I really hold on to is that, what we can't do this year, there's always a next year. So I think educating myself into how this whole system works, and slowly trying to change it one at a time, not on my own but with others. I think Mary Ward was way ahead of herself when she said that women in time will do much, because we know, at least at the UN, that whenever women are part of the group changing, that it actually makes a lot more difference for the village. So for me, I work a lot about gender equality, because it is really important for us that half of the world is part of the decision making, because otherwise it's always going to be skewed. We need to be able to hear how other people are, especially the ones who are affected. They need to be part of that decision making. And the only way I can change that, Brenda, is if I do that myself. I can't say, oh, you have to be part of the decision making, and then the young people that I work with, I don't listen to. I have to work with them and hear their vision and try to work with them on how do we change this world, because I can't do it on my own. It will take a village. It will take all of us. I also realize here is that, in fact, poverty is a decision made by the powerful. And because of that, I have won the lottery of birth, because I was born in a family that had the means to educate me and believed in education and supported me in that education. And then that trajectory gave me to where I am now. I believe that a lot. But not everybody has that. And so we need to be able to provide for those who are not born in this, lottery of birth. And so for me, that is my role. My role is to make sure that others are also having this opportunity, whether that's writing to member states to make them realize that, hey, this is happening in your country. You need to hear about the work that these young people are doing, and you need to make sure that they have the opportunities so that they also reach the full potential that will help your country as well. And part of that is making the young women and men themselves speak about it directly to their leaders here at the UN.
You
And
really are
so,
giving the young people confidence to use their voice for change, because I think sometimes we think that someone else is the powerful, but we too have power. And I
exactly.
think that's a real Mary Ward sensibility. It's a Mary Ward way of proceeding, that she listened to the voice of God, to the power within her, present in her faith, and she found a way to feel that empowerment and do something about it. And I think one of the things we pick up as members of our congregation is that we too have a voice and we have a power, and we help the young people we encounter, the lay people, the people who work with us, beside us, in front of and back of us. We help them to say we have the power to change. How that is measured over time is yet to be seen in our generation. And I say our, in the later part of the 20th and 21st century. We're
Mhm.
still trying to discover, instead of ruining our earth, we need to do something about healing it and working for social justice for the planet as well, for the people on it, right?
Yes, that's true. I think that's the one thing that I have gained from being part of um, this group of Mary Ward women, that belief that God loves us so much, that we have that power in us because God loved us so much. So every one of us is a child of God, but also that love is what allows us to be the best of who we are, and to be that person that God has created us to be.
Mhm.
And not to let that go just because somebody says to you, you can't, you're a woman, you can't do that. For
Mhm.
her belief that, no, we're all the same, we're all loved by God, so we all can do these things to make this a better place. That's a very important message that we have, that we can share to the people, because a lot of people have been made to think that they're not enough. And I think for us to work against this whole hatred that's, seems to be happening worldwide, is for us to really speak to people and say, hang on, you are loved by God. Before anything else, you are loved, and you have to believe that you can be the best person that God has created you. Doesn't matter what other people say to you. Doesn't matter what if they say that, oh, you're a migrant, you're a refugee. For us, it's being able to say to people that you are loved by God. You have this opportunity within you, this power, as you say, within you, to be this best person that you are. And
Mhm.
let's make that, because it will take all of us to save this one world of ours. And I think that is important message for us to continue to share that discernment, to share that belief in the power of love. And one of the things she says to us, we have gifts, but those gifts are to be shared in the service of our world. They're not to be kept just for yourself. They're to be shared.
I think I'm with you there, and I agree so much that the power of love has to somehow be indicated more in our everyday lives. It's unfortunate that the word God has somehow been tainted for others who see God as a superstition and as a figure up in the sky somewhere, instead of seeing the imagination of co-creating a sense of spiritual goodness that is a much higher and more infinitely loving than we can imagine. And some of us will call that God. And at the same time, there are those who reject the notion of that. And
Mhm.
places like that we've set up, like the UN, like other justice movements around the world, and we have to separate it from the faith base. But you get to bring that into that arena as, religious men and women doing the work of raising conscious awareness that we can do better
Mhm. Mhm.
and that we can be better for all those goals that's been set up by governments who are warring against each other for power.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that we face as faith-based organization is, of course, if you really look at it, a number of these wars are often faith-based as well, because people use the faith to start all this for power grab and all these things. And so for us, it's really important that we we are able to demonstrate that this is who God is. God is love more than anything else, and that that there might be people who use this for the wrong reasons, or for to grab power or anything like that, but that's not the truth. That's not what Jesus is about. That's not what God is about. We've always called to have right relationship with each other, and that means really looking after each other.
Just as we kind of move into the end of the conversation, but not quite, I want to ask you about what kinds of initiatives, when we talk about God and religion and the UN, we have these wars going on in the Middle East. What kinds of initiatives have you seen made
Mhm.
from the standpoint of being one of these religious NGOs at the UN?
Mhm.
How have you been able to impact any of the decisions coming out of the UN based on the war in Israel and Gaza, Syria, Ukraine, and all the big wars going on right now?
In relation to that, we basically work as a group. So there's a lot of faith-based organizations at the UN. It's a challenge to actually speak with one voice, but people are trying. You mentioned about the war in Gaza, so there's a group that actually stands outside the UN, the US mission quite regularly every Thursday, just to say that, hang on, like stop the war in Gaza. um, People are dying, kind of thing. But there is also a group that includes Jewish groups as well, that are protesting and making people aware that this isn't just about Muslims versus Jews and all these kind of things. It's not one or the other, that both are being affected by this war. There's another group that has actually organized to go to Washington, D.C. about the situation in Haiti, because Haiti is really very much affected by the number of guns that come from the US to Haiti. So they're working on that side, speaking with them. The challenge for us, of course, is that we're not a government. So as non-government organizations, we're not part of the negotiations of the UN. But I think we're being heard in the way that we write letters to speak to our member states and talk to them about what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in DRC, to work with them on that. But we cannot give up. We just have to continue doing what we're doing. And I think that's the role that we as faith-based organizations can do, to be able to show that we can have a dialogue. We can sit down and talk about this and work it out without bombing each other. And it is really important, I think, for us, especially for the religious leaders, to speak out and say this isn't acceptable.
Yes, I am with you there, Janet, and I'm grateful to have all these little points in our conversation to touch on, so that people, listeners, can go and have their own conversations and do their own research and critical thinking, to find ways to impact what it is they do in their neighborhoods and their
Mhm.
activism wherever they are, right? As in another of the podcasts, we are called to cross the Alps with the resources that we have. Even if we don't do it literally, there are lots of Alps to be crossed in our own communities. Hmm? As usual, I kind of come to a conclusion in the conversation by asking the guest, that's you, Janet, what is your one truth that you live by? You may have mentioned it before, but if you want to leave us with one thing, one phrase, one thought, on even a word that you live by.
I think what I live by is something that is not even from Mary Bull, is always bloom where you are planted. I know, I think it's one of the other saints,
Mm.
but that is one thing that I live by, because I think it is really important. You know, somebody said to me once that the truth is sometimes you might be the only Bible that the person reads.
Mm.
And so I have to be true to who I said I am, that I'm a Christian. So I try hard. I don't always get there. Sometimes I fail, but I try to bloom wherever I'm planted. I try to do the best that I can.
That's
Mhm.
really quite perfect. Thank you so much for leaving us with that. In terms of being the only Bible someone might read, that's leaving me with something to think about as well. So thank you so much, Janet. And I really appreciate your making time in your busy schedule for us, and much blessings. And now for the wrap up. You have just had a human experience from a spiritual being. We have so much to learn. So go forth to love and speak the truth. Ad majorem Dei Gloriam.